Piece of My Heart by Alan Huntsman. Our first love never leaves us. Our first love always has a piece of our heart. Peter Denning knew of this reality all too well. It didn't matter what he did. He could move far across the sea to some foreign land, and memories of Jill Blake would still be echoing in his mind. This was his first time he had gone on a date in nearly a full year, and it seemed to be going well. The girl, her name was Tiffany Masterson, seemed to show signs of interest, as far as he could tell. She asked a lot of questions, leaning forward in conversation with an eager look in her eyes. At one point she had even touched his arm, leaving her hand there a moment, as if wanting him to absorb the feel of it. He was no champ at reading signs of attraction in a girl, but he felt something good there, a spark. Despite his caution, he was interested in a follow-up date. He was surprised she didn't ask him about his scars. He had some along his lower neck and behind his ears. How they came was a secret he held close to him, rarely ever to unveil it. He was glad the subject was never brought up. After dinner, they went on a little stroll through the quiet neighborhood. She took his hand at one point. Another sign perhaps. They came upon the little white cat coiled up like a comma near the wheel well of a small car parked alongside the street. Terror jabbed him in the chest and neck like ice-cold nails. He composed himself as well as he could. No loud gasp or scream, but Tiffany definitely noticed his tension. "Are you okay?" Tiffany asked. Dark-rimmed glasses hung on the edge of her nose. Large blue earrings dangled from her ears. She wore a dark blouse and blue jeans. The cat's green eyes gleamed like phosphorescence. It calmly meowed, looking almost like a small, shy child scared to socialize, though he knew better. He knew it could be one of them. "Can we turn around?" he asked. "Why?" she said with amused confusion. He couldn't think of an excuse. All he had to offer was the truth. "Cats give me the creeps, okay?" They turned around and walked back. The cat zipped off into the thickening shadows. "Oh my gosh, why? I think they're cute. My sister has a cat." Peter sighed. Shoot. What had been a good evening was probably going to collapse into a mess. He couldn't just change the subject now. Doing so would only feed the fire of her curiosity. He would just have to dive in head first and hope he wouldn't climb out with too many scratches. "I had some bad experiences with a cat." Tiffany giggled, letting go of his hand. Uh-oh, was that a sign she was losing interest? "Seriously?" she said. "Did one scratch you, bite you? What I'm about to tell you is going to sound ridiculous. I don't blame you if you don't believe me." "Okay." Her voice carried snarky amusement. Yep, this date was a sinking ship. Despite this, he began his tale. It all started with a funeral. This was about a year ago. He had been by her side the entire time, her bracing support as she wept periodically throughout the funeral services. She looked as dry as a husk by the time they walked back to his car. Her eyes were still red and so tired, but the crying had stopped. Her sister Kathy, dead at just 22 years, had fallen asleep at the wheel while driving the freeway coming home from work. It was her second back-to-back shift, and the lack of sleep had gotten the best of her. The black cat with the white patch on its breast sat by the trunk of an oak tree near the path where they had parked. Jill, probably hoping for any relieving distraction from her grief, veered toward it. "Ah, adorable," she said. The cat purred rustily and brushed its head against her feet. "Darling." Jill picked up the cat, hugging it closely to her chest, kissing its head. The cat then suddenly leapt from her arms and zigzagged through tombstones toward where her sister's casket would soon be lowered and buried. Jill smiled as she watched the cat sniff around the area. Fresh tears flowed from her eyes. Peter placed his hand on her back, searching for more words of comfort, but finding only trite repetitions. "Watch over her, Kitty," he said, feeling a small twinge of regret, hoping it didn't sound like a rude joke. Jill glanced up at him, smiling. Tears dripped over her thin, tan lips. Cats are watchers in the afterlife, or at least that's what the myths say. Peter caressed her back, looking on thoughtfully. "Let's go back to your place. You need rest. I'll make you soup." She turned, hugging him, burying her face in his chest. "Later we will. Let's spend time with my mom first. She needs me." Jill looked up at him, and it was that moment Peter realized he was in love. It was a love that radiated so strongly he felt it burn like fire in every fiber of his being. She was beautiful in her grief. Dark hair tousled over her shoulder, eyes like sapphires. Tears dangled from the edge of her chin. He brushed them away and kissed her then, a long, warm kiss. She caressed his cheek. "I can't believe she's gone," Jill said. Her tear-clouded eyes looked dazed with reflection. "I had talked to her the very afternoon before she died. I heard her laugh. He hugged her closer. I know. Let's go visit your mom." They climbed into the car, and as Peter started the engine, he saw the cat scampering across the path and under the bordering fence across a weed field toward an old house. The house had been abandoned for years, and gazed over the graveyard like some long-forgotten idol. "Looks like that old abandoned home is the kitty's home now," Jill said. "Along with whatever else lives in there," Peter said with a slightly foreboding tone. It was 7 p.m. by the time they arrived at the apartment. A roller coaster of emotions were on display at her mother's house. At some moments laughter, as they reminisced about cherished memories. Other moments neared obsessive expressions of shock and confusion, often followed by gushes of tears and hugs. Jill was exhausted. "I'm going to lay down," she said. "I'll make soup for you." "Thank you." She paused at the entrance of the short hall where a row of blotchy, multicolored paintings hung. She spent much of her free time dabbling with paints. The ones currently displayed portrayed bright colors that brought to mind bubbly laughter and summer. Another work in progress lay on the corner of the nearby couch, an image of a woman drowning in tears, an expression of her current rite of grief. She also had a roommate named Stacy, who was gone for a long portion of the summer. Jill had the apartment all to herself. She turned and said, "I want to visit her grave again next week. Will you come with me?" A weight pressed on his shoulders, but he dutifully acquiesced. "Of course." "Thank you." She shuffled off to bed, drooping like a rag doll. By the time the soup was finished, Peter discovered Jill was already asleep. He ate the soup alone, washed the dishes, and stepped out around 9 that night. A couple days later, as soon as Peter ended his shift at Rinaldi's bookstore, he swung by her apartment and picked her up. The grief cycle was in full swing, a chaotic scramble of emotional seasons. 2 days ago, she teeter-tottered between dazed shock, weary depression, and overwhelming sadness. That late afternoon, she was suddenly bouncing with acceptance, a smile on her face and a vitality in her eyes. She carried a picture with her, showing it to Peter as he navigated the back road of town to the cemetery. It was Jill with her sister Kathy, back when they were 10 years of age. The girls had painted their faces like silly clowns and had placed olives on their fingers. She belly laughed about it, snorting and squeaking. Peter laughed too. "I remember this day," she said. "Oh gosh. I watched some movie that had a circus in it. I can't remember the movie. And we decided to be clowns." She gasped laughter. "You're like budding Freddy Kruegers with those olives on the end of your fingers." Jill lightly slapped his shoulder. "Ew, not that creepy monster." Peter guffawed laughter as he slowed the Accord and steered through the gate of the cemetery. Iron letters arched above the gate, spelling Hillary Cemetery. Someone else was in the cemetery as well, parked on the far north end. A tall man stood before a grave with his hands in his pockets. He parked the car in the shade of an oak and stopped the engine. Jill gripped her laughter and took on a more solemn demeanor. "I'm glad to see you're doing a little better," Peter said. She looked at him. "Yes, sleep did me some good." In that moment, her eyes clouded over with that dreamy look. "I dreamed about her, Peter. I dreamed we were by the pond where we used to play as children. The sun was setting. She told me she had to leave for a time, like the sun, but she would rise again." She chuckled. "I asked her if I was dreaming. She took my hand and said, 'This is no dream.'" Tears welled in her eyes. She wiped them away. It looked like the emotional roller coaster was turning toward the downward spiral of sadness and depression again. They got out of the car and walked over to the grave. A lone bird chirruped softly and ponderingly somewhere. It was a perfect summer day, not too hot, not even a breeze. There it was, the grave of Kathy Blake. A fresh mound of dirt lay before the tombstone. The inscription read, "Forever a light in our lives and hearts. Kathy Blake, born April 10, 2000, died June 30th, 2023. 2 pots of yellow and white flowers flanked the tombstone." "Wow," Jill said, voice choked to nearly a whisper. "She's really gone. Sometimes I think I'll wake up one morning to see a text message from her, or she'll be at the door wanting to eat lunch with me." She placed her arm around his back. He pulled her in closer, kissing her forehead. She buried her face in his shoulder, sniffling. The wet of her tears soaked through his shirt sleeve. She pulled her face away, looking back at the wedge of tombstone, and said, "She's just a corpse in there. Over time she'll be nothing but a pile of bones." "Her spirit lives on," Peter said, though his words sounded weak and trite under the pall of grief. "I hope so," Jill said. A soft meow caught their attention. "Oh, hello." He heard the purr and looked down to see the little black cat brushing and stirring at Jill's feet. The cat then zipped over and stood atop Kathy's tombstone, tail coiling like a trail of smoke from a chimney. It meowed again. "Why, what a good kitty. Have you been watching over my sister for me?" The cat seemed to respond to Jill's question by pawing at her and meowing. "That's good. I bet you watch over everyone here, don't you?" The cat more urgently trilled and returned to Jill's feet, butting its head against her. "That cat has taken quite a liking to you," Peter said. "I wonder who lost it," she said. "I don't see an identification tag. I love its black color and the white blotch on its chest. It's like a lightning strike. The Flash. Super cat." "Dork," she said. "I know." She reached down to pick up the cat, but it scampered away, meandering through gravestones, pausing now and then to sniff or paw at something. "Aren't black cats bad luck?" Peter said. "Oh, quiet, you." Her face crinkled with uneasiness. "Stop scaring me." Peter giggled. "I'm sorry. There's just something uncanny about cats. Cats look like they always got something up their sleeve. They seem smarter than we give them credit for. Like they know or see something we don't. It's sometimes said cats manipulate their owners into becoming the pets." She waved her hand dismissively. "You make them sound creepy and evil. Yuck." Not exactly what he was aiming for, but she was emotional after all. "I do think cats can see spirits. That may be why they can comfort those dying. Maybe they absorb bad vibes. Maybe so," he said. They walked back to the car. As Peter started the engine, he noticed the little black cat was lingering by Kathy's tombstone once again. Peter sat with Tiffany on a park bench. Tiffany had scooted over to the far edge, a bad sign, yet she was still engaged with his story, asking questions as he told it. She crossed her legs, one foot waving up and down. "So this next part is where things get..." He paused, trying to think of the right word. She found one for him. "This is when things get weird, right?" "Yeah, weird and scary. You're putting me through the ringer tonight. You almost had me crying, and now you're going to scare me. You wanted to know why I'm scared of cats. He raised his hands matter-of-factly. Yeah, she chuckled. Guess I asked for it, huh? This next part I tell you, this is when you might think I'm crazy. Okay. She folded her arms and nodded. She looked stiff and uncomfortable, sitting on the edge of that bench. Not at all what Peter had in mind at the start of the date, but it seemed the only way out now was straight through. He carried on with his tale. One evening, Peter and Jill were sitting on the couch in the living room. A new painting hung displayed on the wall behind the couch, the image of a woman drowning in her tears. Jill blurted words from her mouth like volleys of machine gun fire, eyes wide and alight like exploding firecrackers. Peter didn't know whether to listen or hit the deck. Whoa, hold up. Say that again, Peter said. She took a deep breath. She was still dressed in the clothes she had been sleeping in, black and white checkered sweatpants and a Snoopy t-shirt. Okay, I saw Kathy. She appeared right at my window, Peter. I'm not joking. Peter gawked at her, nonplussed. He had heard of grief becoming so intense in a person that it led to delusional thinking and hallucinations. He had kidded himself, believing that Jill could plow right through her grief and be right as rain in no time. He figured a funeral and time with family would help process things to a close, which, he had to admit to himself, was incredibly selfish and stupid. But a deep part of himself had believed it, even hoped for it. The ugly reality was there before him. She was doing way worse than he realized. You mean, he fumbled for the words, you dreamed Kathy was there. She leaned forward, clutching his arm, her fingers cold on his skin. No, I was awake. I woke up to use the bathroom. Then I heard scratching on the window. I opened the blinds to see what it was, and there she was, Peter, floating in the air, still dressed in the dark green dress we buried her in. And that cat, it was there. It was the cat scratching the window. Jill, he hesitated. She sighed in frustration. I can tell you don't believe me. You've got that doubtful, drooping posture you always have when you don't. But I saw it. Jill, listen. She turned away briefly, then turned back to him, folding her arms, face crinkled with a deep frown. She looked like an angry child. You're going through a lot, more than even I understand. I lost my grandpa, but it was different. I really didn't know him that well, and he was so old and struggling it was a mercy when he finally passed on. I've never lost anyone like a sibling, someone so close. You had such a special bond with Kathy. What are you trying to say, Peter? Just get it out already. He paused, disappointed in himself. He had made her angry, and that wasn't at all what he was aiming to do. I know what you're trying to say, she said with a hushed voice, barely above a whisper. You think I'm going crazy, don't you? Tears glinted in her eyes, her tan skin darker with a flush. You think I've gone all wacky and I'm seeing things or that I'm just trying to get attention? Jill, I think you're going through the normal grief cycle. That's what I think. And what you saw last night was just a normal part of the cycle. She stared at him with a wounded expression glaring from her eyes. One tear welled over and coursed down her cheek. Then she said, I want to be alone. Peter stared, unsure how to react. Will you please leave? Jill, I wasn't trying. Just go. She waved her hand at him. Okay. He stood up, clapping his hands on his thighs resignedly. Okay, I'll go. He walked to the door, opened it, and took one more glance at her beautiful, though tearful, glowering face. It was the last time Peter would see her that way again. 3 days passed. Peter went to work. He took long walks. He joined his buddy Kevin for video game sessions, and he did his best to pretend he was just fine. But in reality, all he could think about was Jill. He continuously reimagined that last moment with her in the apartment. He tried to think of different things he could have said, or how he could have said it more delicately. Dude, Kevin said, They were playing NBA 2K. I'm totally whipping your ass. You haven't even touched your soda. What the hell, man? Kevin wore a t-shirt his sister Sarah, a graphic designer, had custom made for him. It depicted a group of squirrels posing sexily in bikinis. The caption read, "Squirrels, squirrels, squirrels." The shirt was a silly riff on the Motley Crue song, "Girls, Girls, Girls." Stacks of old CDs filled racks next to the flat-screen TV, a TV bought after months of savings. An old red Stratocaster leaned crookedly in the corner by the door, missing a G-string. Hendrix, Maiden, Dream Theater, and a whole assortment of bands adorned his walls in the form of posters. A large banner was draped across the wall above his bed of AC/DC's Angus Young, snarling through a guitar solo while performing his famous duck walk. Peter and Kevin had flirted with the idea of starting a band, even tried a couple jam sessions, but Peter just never fit Kev's musical vision. "You're a round peg in my square hole, Pete," Kevin said once. "Still, I like you. You can stick around." "Yeah, I'm kinda not feeling it," Peter said in reply to Kevin's expression of concern. Kevin vigorously tapped buttons on the controller, having stolen the ball. He raced down the court with Kawhi Leonard, tossed up a three and scored. "Dude, you're not even trying." "It's Jill, man." "Oh." Kevin rolled his eyes. "Come on, move on, will ya? There's always some other chick." Peter lackadaisically dribbled the ball down the court with Ja Morant and made an errant pass. He didn't even care as Kevin stole the ball again and brought it down for a thunderous dunk. His mind just wasn't there. "She won't talk to me. She doesn't even answer my texts. We had this disagreement a while back. She's going through a hell of a lot of grief, to be fair. Her sister died in a car accident. Tragic thing. But she... You know how people get when they're grieving? She had like this dream her sister came back to her. I told her it was just a dream. Now she's pissed." Kevin laughed. "Man, you're a total jerk. Geez." "I know. It was true." Peter felt like a jerk. Kevin paused the game, setting the controller aside. "You know what I do in situations like that?" "What?" Peter asked. "I get me another soda." Kevin got up and moseyed on over to the fridge. "Come on, Kev. I thought you had some deep words of wisdom." "There's always another soda to crack open," Kevin said as he opened a Mountain Dew. Some of the fizz dotted one of the sexy squirrels on his shirt, just as there's always more pussy to crack open somewhere else. "You don't get any pussy, Kev." "Screw you." Kevin plopped back in his chair, gulped down more soda, and belched. "You're just not a shallow jerk like me, Pete. You're a better man. I don't even know why you come over. You know, when I got nothing else better to do." Peter picked up his soda and cracked it open, taking a sip. A brief moment of silence. Then Kevin said, "On a more serious note, man, you gotta stop staring in the sun. There's so much around you." "What do you mean?" "Dude, what do you think I mean? This girl, Jill, whatever her name is, she's just a blinding sun glare in your life, and you keep gazing into it, missing all the potential around you." "Huh. What are you, a shaman, a wise man now, Kev?" "Chew on that food for thought a while." Kevin unpaused the game. Peter did try to think about it, but Kevin just didn't understand. Jill wasn't just another pussy to crack open, like another soda to Kevin. Jill was so much more than that, so much more. Though he hadn't mentioned it to Jill, he was beginning to think about the possibility of marrying her. A life with her in the future was beginning to materialize in his mind. Sometimes he imagined waking up beside her, cooking breakfast for her. He imagined lazy afternoons with both of them laying in a hammock in the backyard of a home they owned, reading together. He imagined her covering the walls of their home with her paintings. But then this trouble came along, snarling and fouling things up. Peter and Kevin played video games a little bit longer, and then Peter decided to slip out for home. Late that night, as he laid in bed, turning over and over in his mind those last moments with Jill, his phone brightened with a message on the nightstand beside him. He reached over, picking up the phone. When he saw Jill's name displayed on the screen, his heart quickened, and he sat up. He opened the message. "Peter, can you come over? I'd like to talk to you." He replied, "On my way." When she opened the door, a chill spread over his back and a jolt of terror pierced his heart like a cold blade. Something was wrong. He could feel it, and he could see it. Her eyes were sunken. She gazed back at him with a deadpan emptiness Peter had never seen in her before. Also, her skin was a deathly pale color. "Hi, Jill. How are you?" Peter said. She turned away and walked to the couch, leaving the door open for him to come in. His stomach sunk like a cold rock as he stepped into the shadowed apartment. A small lamp was turned on, providing some light. Jill sat on the couch, arms stiffly folded on her thighs, gazing blankly at the floor. Peter sat beside her. "Jill," he said, "what's going on?" She said nothing, only stared like an abandoned doll. Even when he reached over and gently brushed strands of her hair back, she didn't move at all, and her skin was terribly cold to the touch. Then something else caught his eye, something that made him sick, that made the room seem to spin. There were 2 puncture holes along the upper part of her neck. It looked like someone had jabbed the end of 2 thick needles there. A disturbing thought came to him. She's hurting herself. It's really come to that. It's really gotten that bad. She turned and looked at him, her head turning stiffly and slowly, as if she was a robotic doll and someone had a remote control somewhere, manipulating her movement. When she spoke, her voice sounded mechanical. "Kathy came again," she said. Peter gazed in cautious terror. He didn't want to upset her again. This time he spoke agreeable words. "Okay, Kathy came." He nodded. "What did she say?" A smile stretched across her lips, slow and mechanical, like an animatronic device. His heart pounded so hard it felt it might rip from his chest. His fingers tightly clutched the arm of the couch. "I will be with her again," Jill said. "We will be together forever." Her hand reached out and touched his. Her fingers were ice cold, like worms sliding over his knuckles. "You can be with us too." She leaned over to kiss him, and that's when Peter noticed the teeth for the first time, 2 long, sharp fangs slicing over her pale lips. Peter gasped. Jumping to his feet, he tumbled back into the door. Jill chuckled, and her eyes sparked as though a small green flame ignited within them. "Drink eternal," she said, with a near orgasmic moan. Peter stumbled out the door, slamming it shut. He ran down the short flight of stairs out into the parking lot and stopped short of his car, where the black cat sat on the edge of the sidewalk like a sentinel. Its eyes glowed green in the night, black tail coiling like a trail of smoke. The white patch on its chest shone like some fearsome badge. Oh my gosh. Tiffany covered her mouth. Peter couldn't tell if she was trying to hide a grin because she thought his story was absolutely ridiculous, or if she was genuinely disturbed by what he'd told her. "I don't blame you if you don't believe me," Peter said. "If I was in your shoes, I wouldn't believe me." "So," she winced, searching for words, "you're trying to tell me vampires exist and cats are their servants?" "From my personal experience, this is partly true, though there's more to it than that. I don't want to believe you. As I stated before, I don't blame you." "Ugh," she scowled, poking out her tongue in disgust. "It's just creepy. And that friend of yours, Kevin?" She waved her hand dismissively. "He's an acquired taste." She wrinkled her nose. There was a brief, thoughtful silence. Then she said, "So you ran off then, jumped in your car and washed your hands of it all." Peter took a deep breath, visualizing the next series of events that took place. It was still raw and painful, as though he was living in those moments again. "I wish it had been that easy," Peter said. "No, matters came at a greater cost than that." As Peter sidled up through the parking slot of his car, The cat had tried to brush over his feet, nearly tripping him along the way. As Peter jumped into his car, he heard the cat hiss and screech. When he turned on the headlights, backing away, the cat appeared, highlighted in the beams, flashing its fangs at him. He drove home in a horrified stupor, at one point running a stop sign and nearly colliding with someone. Burning in his mind were those blade-sharpened scissors, appearing between Jill's pale lips. That night he couldn't sleep. He tried to call Kevin, but Kevin never answered. It was around 4 a.m. when Peter heard scratching on the window, a rusty, slightly squeaky sound. His muscles tensed, his heart raced. He hoped against hope it wasn't what he thought it was outside those closed blinds. Maybe somehow a twig had gotten on the windowsill, and a slight breeze was scraping it against the window. That was unlikely, however. He lived on the top level of his apartment building. None of the trees on the property reached that high. His stomach sickened with dread as the scratching started again. He reluctantly rolled out of bed and took a step closer to the window, and the scratching could be heard again, 3 distinct swipes. Part of him wanted to try to ignore it, just climb back in bed, bury himself with covers, and hope it all just went away. But this wouldn't just go away. He couldn't just ignore it. What was out there already had a piece of him, a piece of his heart. He wrapped his fingers around the cord, fingers trembling and tingling with adrenaline. He pulled the cord, turning the blinds into open slots, and floating before his window was so shocking, so horrifying. His mouth opened to scream, but it seemed the scream was too big for his mouth. All that came out was a small choking sound and a moan. He recognized the 2 personages haloed by moonlight, despite the changes that had occurred. Their lips were red, as if a rim of blood had been traced around them. Pointed teeth flared menacingly as each of them smiled at him wickedly. Their skin was white as snow, but the eyes were empty of any love or purity. Radiating from them instead was a fiery lust that was eternal. On the right was Jill. Despite her shriveled paleness and the spark of evil in her eyes, the hair was the same, shoulder length with a slight waviness to it. She was wearing the same checkered sweatpants and Snoopy t-shirt. Only now there was what looked like a small fleck of blood on the shirt. Kathy wore the green dress she was buried in. Flakes of dirt clung to the edges of the dress. A third figure materialized in the shadows next to them. The light of the streetlight illuminated Kevin, dressed in his squirrel shirt. Sitting on the windowsill, eyes glowing a fiery green, was the black cat. Its tail curled like a snake. It, too, flashed its fangs at him, and he knew without a doubt that the cat was the orchestrator of this whole thing. He found himself hooked to those green eyes, magnetized by them. The eyes pulled at him from some deep, inner place, causing a relaxing, lulling numbness to flow throughout him. When the 3 figures spoke to him, their words seemed to slither into his mind like some horrid, creeping creature. Come drink with us, Peter. No, he would fight it. No matter how tempting, he would fight it. In that moment he noticed something horrid within himself, a monster that existed within his own soul and mind. It was something deep, dark, and vicious. It growled menacingly and desperately wanted to feed. Come, Peter. Jill's voice rang in his head. It was like a soothing, tempting melody. This way we can be together. Forever. Jill opened her mouth, and a tongue slithered forth from her maw like some alien snake emerging from a hole. The tongue scraped along the lips, smearing blood. A large wave of lust pressed upon him. A blurry, weakening fog shrouded his mind. There was also a feeling like invisible limbs were gathering around him, guiding him to go toward his new vampire friends. There was one thought he used as a grapple, as a way to pull himself free from this gathering storm. He remembered Jill as she was when they stood together in the graveyard. He remembered the first moment when he realized how truly he loved her. Peter shrieked, pushing back in the whirlwind of lust and pain. The cat screeched and hissed, its back arching. He grabbed the cord and yanked the blinds closed, shutting away the horrid, unholy sight. It was like a massive unseen force burst out of him in that moment, causing his body to fling back. He tumbled to the floor of his apartment. Sweat covered his brow. He gasped for breath, closing his eyes against sickening dizzy spells. The force that had been within him had been overpowering, consuming his muscles and movements, and nearly fully devouring his thoughts and will. Now, the force having fled, Peter was exhausted, so exhausted he could barely move. In that bleak moment, all Peter could think was, "I've got big trouble on my hands." There was a discomforting quiet as Peter paused in the telling of his story. He looked over at Tiffany. She sat in the same position, one leg crossed over the other, arms folded, face glancing about with suspicion someone might sneak up on them. Her brow creased with pained confusion. Peter knew he would never see this girl again, and just as well. How could they really connect, considering his bizarrely horrifying experience? How could they ever truly deepen and entwine roots together? "A vampire," Peter said, her gaze zeroed in on him like magnet to metal. Even now it seemed so weird, so otherworldly, to say that word in association with Jill. She was a vampire. I don't want to believe it. Shit like that doesn't happen in the real world. That's what I want to believe. Vampires only exist in books like Dracula and Salem's Lot, not the real world. Well, they do exist. She hesitated, then winced, adjusting her glasses. "I guess what I want to say is that I believe you, though I don't want to, because it's so tragic and scary. What did you do?" The memory of the moment flashed like a lightning strike in his mind. "I did what I had to, and it changed me forever." Peter carried on with his tale. He would have to kill them. He realized that almost immediately after his first night's encounter. If he didn't, they would never leave him alone, and sooner or later he would break. Peter spent all his free time reading about vampires. He Googled about vampire myths. He bought himself a copy of Dracula. He watched the movie Nosferatu. He had nailed a cross to his front door, and each time he came across his neighbor, an old man named Frank McNill, he gave Peter funny eyebrow raises, perhaps wondering what sect he had suddenly committed to. One afternoon, as Peter inserted his key into the deadbolt, Frank spoke up, still bent forward sprinkling water on his plants. "It's a hard world out there." "It sure is," Peter said. "It's good for us to look in places which can build our hope." Ah, Peter thought. He's seen the cross on my door and is wondering what's possessed me to put it there. Peter unlocked the door and pushed himself inside, closing the door on further conversation. Hope. Peter was trying to have hope, though much of it was smothered by horrendous fear and grief. The one he truly loved wasn't just dead. She was corrupted. She was a monster. The myths and legends claimed vampires were repulsed by the sign of a Christian cross. He had also strung cloves of garlic along the windowsill of his bedroom. No visitation since doing so. It seemed to be working. He sat on the floor of his bedroom, gripping a metal stake in his left hand and holding the hammer in the other. He tried to visualize the stake balanced over the chest of Jill, and he tried to imagine himself carrying out the difficult deed. These periods of chilling meditation sometimes worked him up with terror to the point that he became paralyzed with it, shivering, heart slamming in his chest. It was hard to see the monster Jill had truly become. When he tried to visualize the moment, all he saw were the memories, the good moments, flooding his mind. There was also the horror of having to slam metal through flesh and bone. Would he even be able to cope with that? And where would he find them? Vampires couldn't withstand sunlight. He imagined their bodies tucked away in some culvert, some basement, or some abandoned place. They could be anywhere. He was flying. Mountains, valleys, and oceans passed by underneath him. He was soaring among the clouds. He was high enough that it looked as though he could touch the sun. She was there as well, hand extended. He reached out and took it, warm and soft within his grip. She pulled him into a full embrace, body to body. They soared together over mountain, valley, and sea. A shadow fell over the scene, deep and black. Thunder boomed amid the shadow. A coldness closed around him as she changed in form. Her eyes turned black, her skin shriveled pale, her mouth opened. Peter burst awake to find himself within her grasp. Not only her grasp, the others as well, Kathy and Kevin. Jill held him by the arms and her fangs neared his neck, a hiss issuing forth from her maw. Peter screamed. He fought with her grip, shaking violently, thrusting away with his legs. All three of them converged upon him, fangs exposed. Words filled his mind like painful daggers. Eternal. Drink eternal. Peter scooted away, falling off the edge of the sidewalk. Outside. How the hell did I get out here? He thought. He jumped to his feet and ran blindly, not caring where he was actually going, just as long as it was far away from them. After some time, he stopped at the edge of an intersection and leaned against a sign, panting out of breath. He looked behind him and all around. He couldn't see them anywhere. It seemed he had escaped them, at least for a time. He oriented himself and realized he was near the cemetery, nearly a couple blocks from his apartment. He looked across the street and saw the faint silhouette of the cemetery's arched sign in the gloom. Cautiously, he began a route back to his apartment, looking closely in every shadow, his every sense now on high alert. He had experienced a case of sleepwalking. Never in his life had he walked into sleep until this night. They had gotten into his dreams. Like a snake slithering and squeezing its way into a home, they had crawled right into his dreams and had found a way to manipulate him right into their hands. A small figure walked across the road in front of him. It was that cat. The cat stopped, meowed, and then dashed off toward the cemetery. The cemetery. It lingered in Peter's mind once he managed to find his way home without another run-in with his vampire friends. The next morning, Peter loaded his collection of stakes and the hammer in the car, and he headed off to the cemetery. When he arrived, he found the caretaker, a bald man named Gary Pullman, standing over Kathy's grave. Gary had an odd tic. His right eye blinked rapidly, sometimes so rapid it looked like a convulsion. Peter couldn't help an amused smile whenever he talked with Gary. Sometimes he saw the man at the local market or the post office. Peter was about 10 feet away from Kathy's grave when Gary shook his head, right eye shuddering, and said, "Golly, makes me sick. I still can't believe it." "What?" Peter quickened his pace. His stomach churned with sickness when he discovered her grave had been disturbed. A gaping hole was there, and a mound of dirt was tossed untidily to the side. What sick idiots would want to pull a prank like this? Nasty vandalism. Kids these days have no respect for the dead. Cold dread enveloped Peter like a mist. He knew this wasn't mere vandalism. "I just don't get it. This world is just getting worse and worse. Just like the Bible. False accusers. Children debasing the old and the honorable. No longer is there any respect for the dead, either." Gary shook his head. The sun gleamed on his bald pate. He was dressed in a gray t-shirt and jeans. Movement caught the corner of Peter's eye. He turned to see that black cat weaving its way through the grave markers. Gary saw it, too. He rubbed his bald head thoughtfully. "And there's that black cat again. I see it nearly every week, wandering among the dead. It likes to go over to that house over there across the fence, the old Bannerman house. That place is just abandoned now." Now Peter knew where to find them. "I get a funny feeling about that cat," Gary said. Normally I hate cats. They stir up my allergies. But sometimes I just get this urge to go up and pet it. Cats. He smiled crookedly, making a side glance at Peter. They're funny. Sometimes they look like they're smarter than we humans think. Sometimes they look like they might be hiding something. You're more right than you think, Mr. Pullman, Peter said. Gary looked at Peter thoughtfully, right eye shuddering, and then he turned back to the grave. I got the sheriff looking in on this. Whoever done this to this young lady's grave has got prison time coming to them. Oh, they've got more than that coming, Peter thought. They're already suffering. He thought about the stakes and hammer in his car, along with the lighter and matches he picked up from the store along the way. I guess, in a way, I'm ending their suffering. I'm freeing them. Well, I'm on my lunch break, Gary said. You have a good one. Gary walked away. You too, Mr. Pullman, Peter said. The cat was there, sitting like a sentinel by the front door. Peter carried the backpack of stakes and a hammer over one shoulder. He steeled himself and marched forward. Vacant, broken windows glared down at him. Warped, cracked cement guided his path. The cat zipped away, shooting through a gap in a broken window of the basement. That must be the place, he thought, down there in the nasty belly. He hitched the backpack up higher on his shoulder and ventured onward, climbing the steps. The wooden porch creaked under his feet. The beams were loose and wobbly. He treaded lightly. The doorknob was equally loose, and he hardly had to turn it to push the old door open. Glass littered the entryway. The shards had fallen from the little round window on the front door. Plenty of others had inhabited the old abandoned house in the past. Garbage was strewn upon the floor, beer cans and cigarette butts. Some teenagers had spray-painted a smiling face with crosses for eyes on the wall. A little hump of a tongue poked out of the smile. The words "Rad Torture" captioned the image in crooked, blocky letters. A chandelier hung from the entryway ceiling, caked with dust and cobwebs. Straight ahead was another bare room. Perhaps it had been the dining room all those years ago, when the Bannerman family owned it. He briefly tried to imagine them all sitting around a table, a delicious roast displayed in the center. The family laughed and passed along stories and conversation. Now the room was simply cluttered with old, discarded newspapers and magazines. The basement door was open a crack. He pulled out the flashlight and shone it into the darkness. His stomach made a sickening flutter as the beam glimpsed the cat, eyes a blazing green, sitting in the corner of one step. The cat meowed and then darted away like a black projectile deeper into the basement. His heart thudded deeply as he pushed the door all the way open and made that first step. A steady, soft whoosh of air. A bump here, a small scratch there. His senses on high alert, he descended, step by step. A terrible, pungent smell hit his nostrils when he reached the bottom. It was a deathly smell, a musty smell of decay. He shone the flashlight around. The basement was emptied as well, other than the usual littering of beer cans and other discarded garbage. Empty shelves lined the side of one wall like the rib cage of some prehistoric skeleton. It was near the center of the large basement where he saw them, tucked away in the thicker shadows, away from the small strands of light that tried to reach them from the small windows along the upper wall. They all lay in a perfect row. Dark sheets covered them. The cat was there, sitting atop the chest of the center one, eyes aglow. Peter walked toward them, breath shaky, flashlight beam shaking. The cat hissed, its fangs menacingly white. He lowered himself to his knees, removing the pack from his shoulders. He set the flashlight aside in an attempt to open the bag and remove one of the metal stakes. The cat went berserk. It leapt, shooting like a black missile at the flashlight, knocking it away. The light went spinning across the floor, rapidly dancing across the walls. Peter stumbled backwards, wheeling around, looking for the flashlight. A loud, ferocious screech accompanied the sudden pain that erupted in the back of his neck. A fiery, stinging pain. He bellowed a cry in agony and horror, reaching up behind his head where his hands met a wriggling mound of fur. The claws sunk deeply into his neck. The teeth bit deeply into the flesh of his head. The pain was so intense he fell forward, crashing on his face. Dizziness, blurred vision, heart slamming. He dug his hands deep into the fur, squeezing, wringing, jostling. He rocked his head back and forth, wrestling with the cat's claws, but he couldn't break it free. A new pain ignited on his head as the cat jabbed its teeth deeply into his ear. He screamed, high-pitched and hoarse, and leapt to his feet. He flung his body around, trying to shake the cat off. He rushed to the wall and thrust his back into it, slamming the cat between the wall. With each pounding thrust, the cat's claws loosened. Peter pressed the back of his head firmly against the wall, twisting and grinding. He pulled at the cat's paws, ripping them out of the flesh of his neck. He was free of the cat. He gripped it firmly by the neck and drove it hard to the ground. The cat squirmed and squealed, clawing at his arm. He struggled to hold it as he reached for the backpack. He pinned it with his knee, unzipped it, and pulled out a metal stake. The cat silenced as he pressed it to its chest. Its glowing green eyes penetrated him, eyes that seemed to explore his every thought, walking amongst his dreams. A painfully weakening feeling gripped him. Peter fought against it, producing the hammer. He pounded, pounded, pounded. The stake pushed through fur, flesh, and bone. The cat shrieked in agony and menace, paws flinging about in a maniacal frenzy, green eyes bulging and glowing like strange green orbs. Peter pushed the stake through until the cat was firmly fixed to the floor. The cat's flinging and fighting slowed, and soon stopped. He reached for the flashlight, shaky hands fumbling it. He shone the light on the cat corpse, and moaned in horror, sickness, and a strong feeling of guilt. He had never killed anything in his life until this moment. Blood pooled around the midsection where the stake had penetrated. The cat's head leaned to the side, its tongue crookedly poking out between its teeth. The cat morphed before him, its form elongated, its shoulders broadened, its figure blurred in transparency and reshaped. Astonishment paralyzed Peter. What now lay before him was a man, the corpse of a man dressed in a black cassock. His head was bald, his face pale and serene. The stake remained in place, a pool of blood around its edges, serving as a focal point. This was the orchestrator of it all, the lead vampire, all this time disguised and possibly trapped in the form of a cat. Peter examined his own face and neck, smearing blood on his fingers. God knew how bad the injuries on the head and neck were. He couldn't leave. The harder job was yet to come. He carefully lifted the backpack over the newly discovered vampire corpse. He feared as though he might stir it alive somehow if he bumped it, though the myths and legends he'd read about claimed a stake to the heart should disable it. He scooted across the dirty floor towards the others, the stakes clinking within the pack. He set it beside him and then pushed himself up on his knees. He hovered the flashlight beam over the first sheet, hesitating, trying to still himself for what he was about to see. Peter took the edges of the sheet and pulled it back, revealing the face and upper body. "Kevin," Peter said in an out-of-breath, hushed voice. His friend lay still, hands folded over his belly. His skin was so pale and inhuman. Around the mouth, however, was a thin line of red, for Kevin had been drinking. Sorrow, a cold black cloud of sorrow weighed upon every fiber of his being. Yet he knew what he had to do. Peter removed a stake from the backpack and centered it over Kevin's chest. Oh, what reveling, blood-sucking dreams danced and pranced in that mind now. He missed the stake with the first couple strikes of the hammer, but the third and fourth struck, driving it through the shirt, ripping, thudding, cracking, and a disgusting mush sound rose with each hammer strike. The body writhed. Peter felt the cold hand of his friend wriggle and brush against his knee as he finished the deed. It screamed as well. It was a shrill sound like the gates of hell were embedded within that throat. The scent of decay whooshed forth. Peter gagged as he pounded. Next, it was Kathy, who looked much like her sister in the eyes and the shape of her mouth. He had barely gotten to know her before she died. Nothing more than a pleasant handshake and a few words, yet it stung his heart just the same. He pummeled the stake. It was done. Peter pulled back the neck sheet. The pallid, shriveled face of his love, or the one who had once been his love, lay almost peacefully, the chest rising and falling rapidly with breathing. The thing she had become barely resembled her now, deathly pale skin, the ring of blood red on her lips, and the fangs hidden beneath. He closed his eyes and remembered. He remembered that moment when he realized how deeply he loved her. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted one last kiss of goodbye, but he couldn't. Those lips would be cold. He pressed the point of the stake over the heart and pounded it in. He pounded furiously, weeping as he did. He pounded frantically, yelling in anger as he did so, his own yell rivaling her agonizing scream as her body writhed in death throes. And then it was finished. Peter ran and didn't look back. He dashed up the stairs, screaming and weeping still. In his mind, the world was falling. All the world tumbled and spun into a black, deep pit to be swallowed up forever. "And then what did you do?" Tiffany asked. She had gasped and winced in pained astonishment through the entire telling of the wretched experience. "I did what I had to," Peter said. "Staking the heart only disables a vampire. Later I returned and decapitated all their heads." He paused, swallowing. "Then I burned the house down. I lit the house on fire and walked away from it all." A moment of silence. A car horn blared somewhere in the distance. "I still dream about her. I still dream about that moment when I drove the stake in her heart. Only in the dream it's different. Her arms reach up, grasping mine, and she pulls me in, sinking her fangs in my neck. Other times I dream she's normal, and we're just walking along, talking with each other, in love with each other." "Those scars," she said. "I noticed the scars on your neck. Did those—" "Yes, the cat did that. I needed 3 stitches on the one on my head." She shuddered. That's quite a story. Do you believe me?" She hesitated, tilting her head. I don't know what to believe. I don't blame you, and I hope you never stumble upon anything that would prove its truth to you. However, if it is true, you can understand why I'm timid around cats." She chuckled. "Yes, if it is true, I can see that." He walked her back to her car in silence. He wondered what she was thinking. Were those final horrid moments replaying in her mind? "It was nice meeting you." She shook his hand, a limp, quick handshake, and then she got in her Mazda and drove off. Peter got in his own car, the same Accord he'd been driving a year ago, and started the engine. He cut the radio to silence. "Nice girl," he said to his reflection in the rearview mirror. He figured he'd never see her again. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he saw the white cat again, sitting on the edge of the sidewalk. Its eyes glowed in the headlight beams. He pressed the accelerator, speeding up. He hoped he wouldn't see the cat again. He wondered if his first love would be there to meet him in his dreams, for his first love would always have a piece of his heart.